The first hard freeze came to the James River Valley on October 7, 1873, 3 weeks earlier than any settler in the region could remember. Ingrid Halvorsen stood in her dirt yard, 23 miles northwest of Yankton in Dakota Territory, watching ice crystals form on the wooden bucket handle. Her husband Lars had been dead for months, kicked by a spooked horse while breaking sod in June. Her daughter, Safi, 7 years old, lay inside their 12 by 14-foot sod house with a fever that had lasted 6 days. The nearest doctor was a 2-day ride to Yankton, assuming the Missouri River hadn't frozen yet, and Ingrid's entire winter fuel supply for cords of cottonwood she'd spent August splitting by hand sat in an open rick, getting soaked by freezing rain. She'd already lost half a cord to rot. The wood on the bottom had turned black and spongy, worthless for burning. Each night she fed the cast iron stove with increasingly damp fuel that hissed and smoked, producing maybe 60% of the heat dry wood would give. The mathematics was simple and brutal. If she lost another cord to weather, she wouldn't make it to March. If Safi's fever broke but the house stayed cold, pneumonia would finish what the fever started. And if Ingrid spent money on lumber for a proper woodshed, she wouldn't have enough left to buy seed wheat for spring planting. Thomas Brennan had warned her about this exact problem in July. He'd homesteaded 6 miles east in 1869, survived for Dakota winters, and had opinions about everything. He'd stopped by one afternoon in late summer, ostensibly to check on the widow Halvorsen, but really to tell her everything she was doing wrong. "You'll need a woodshed," he'd said, eyeing her uncovered woodpile. "Proper one, built right. Cottonwood's worthless if it gets wet. Learned that my first winter when I lost 3 cords to a November rain, when he lures to death Christmas week." Ingrid had smiled politely and said nothing. She'd calculated the lumber cost $17 for enough boards to build what Brennan described. She had $23 total until spring. Seed wheat would cost $8, sugar, coffee, and salt another $4. Lamp oil, needles, thread, and winter boots for Sophie would take $6 more. That left $5 for everything else, including whatever medical care Safi might need, though Ingrid tried not to think about that part. Jacob Weiss had a different opinion. He'd arrived from Prussia in 1871, trained as a carpenter in the old country, and built beautiful, tight structures that leaked not a drop. He'd constructed Ingrid's sod house after Lars died, refusing payment but accepting 3 of her laying hens in trade. "You need good walls," he'd told her in his careful English, gesturing at her woodpile. "Rain comes sideways here. Wind pushes water through cracks. I've seen sheds that look solid but inside, everything's wet. You want to keep wood dry, you need proper carpentry, tight joints, good roof pitch. Costs money, but it's the only way that works." Mary Catherine O'Brien, who'd come west from Boston in 1870 with ideas about scientific farming and modern methods, had laughed outright when she'd visited in September. "A woodshed, Ingrid, dear, that's frontier thinking. What you need is proper ventilation and elevated storage. I've read articles about it in the agricultural journals. Wood needs air circulation to cure properly. Building walls around it just traps moisture." Mary Catherine's own woodpile sat on a raised platform made from salvaged railroad ties, covered with a canvas tarp that had cost her $4.50. The tarp had ripped in a windstorm 2 weeks ago, and now her wood was getting just as wet as Ingrid's. But Ingrid had been thinking, not about lumber or proper carpentry or scientific farming, about the sod she'd been living in for 4 months. The walls of her house were 3 feet thick, cut from prairie earth in blocks, measuring 14 inches by 24 inches by 4 inches deep. Lars had cut them in May, stacking them like bricks with the grass side down so the roots would knit together. The roof was more sod laid over cottonwood poles, and the whole structure had cost them exactly $11, $9 for the poles, $2 for the window frame they'd bought in Yankton. Everything else had come from the land itself. On October 8th, the morning after the freeze, Ingrid left Sophie with a neighbor woman named Elizabeth Kowalski and walked 2 miles south to where the James River cut through a low bluff. She'd brought Lars's sod spade, a specialized tool with a sharp, flat blade, exactly 14 inches wide, and a plan she hadn't told anyone about because she knew what they'd say. The ground near the riverbank was still soft enough to cut despite the freeze. She worked for 3 hours, slicing through the tough prairie sod, flipping each brick carefully to keep it intact. By noon she'd cut 48 bricks and loaded them onto the small handcart Lars had built for hauling supplies. The location she'd chosen for her woodshed sat 30 feet south of her house, on a slight rise where water wouldn't pool. She'd pasted out the night before, 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, 7 feet high at the peak. That would hold 6 cords of wood stacked properly, enough for a hard winter with some to spare. She'd sketched the design in the margin of her account book, a curved roof, like a barrel cut in half lengthwise, built from bent willow saplings she could cut from the riverbank for free. The first brick went down at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Ingrid had learned from watching her house go up that sod construction followed rules most people didn't understand. The bricks had to be laid grass-side down so the roots would interlock. Each course had to overlap the one below it, like bricks in a chimney, or the whole thing would fall apart. The walls had to lean inward slightly, about 2 inches per vertical foot, or they'd collapse under their own weight. And the structure had to be built in one continuous session if possible, because once sod started drying it became brittle and wouldn't bond properly. Thomas Brennan rode past at 3:30, saw what she was doing, and actually stopped his horse. "Ingrid, that's not going to work," he called out. "Sod sheds leak. I tried one my second year. Whole thing turned into a mud pile after the first rain. You're wasting your time." He didn't say it meanly. He said it the way he'd warn someone about a loose bridge plank, straightforward, trying to help. Ingrid nodded and kept working. She'd laid 18 bricks by then, the first 2 courses of what would be the back wall. By sunset she'd used all 48 bricks and started the stools. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, and Safi was still feverish when she checked on her that evening. But the mathematics had changed. She'd spent nothing. The sod was free, cut from her own claim. The willow saplings for the roof frame would be free. The only thing she'd need to buy was maybe $3 worth of nails to attach the willow frame, and she might not even need those if she could lash the joints with rawhide strips. The next morning, October 9th, brought the first real snow, wet, heavy flakes that clung to everything. Ingrid cut willow saplings from the riverbank while the ground was still soft, selecting 12 that were straight and flexible, each about 9 feet long and thick as her thumb. She'd seen similar bent roof structures before, built by Finnish settlers in Minnesota who used them for saunas. The principle was simple. Green willow would bend without breaking, and once it dried in place, it would hold its curve permanently. She soaked the saplings in the river for an hour to make them even more pliable, then hauled them back on her cart. Jacob Weiss appeared at her claim that afternoon, carrying his carpenter's square and looking concerned. "I heard from Thomas you're building something," he said. "Ingrid, I want to help, but I have to tell you, this won't work the way you think. Sod is 4 walls that sit still. A roof needs to shed water, needs angles and proper drainage. What you're building here, it's going to sag in the middle, collect water, turn into soup." He wasn't being condescending. He'd built 17 structures in Dakota Territory, and he knew what worked. Ingrid offered him coffee, listened to his concerns, and then asked him a question. "How do the Lakota keep their lodge covers dry?" Jacob frowned. "That's buffalo hide, treated with brains and smoke. Completely different." Ingrid nodded. "But it's curved, like what I'm building, and it doesn't leak." Jacob studied her design, scratched his beard, and admitted he'd have to think about that. "If you've stayed with this story so far, I want to ask you something. This channel exists to preserve knowledge that's slipping away, techniques our great-grandparents knew that we've forgotten. The way Ingrid figured things out, with nothing but observation and necessity, that's something worth remembering. If you value that kind of wisdom, join others who are documenting these forgotten methods. Subscribe to help keep this frontier knowledge alive, because once it's gone, it doesn't come back. The willow frame went up on October 10th. Ingrid had built a simple jig from scrap wood, bending each sapling into a half circle with a radius of exactly 4 feet. She anchored the ends into the tops of the sod walls, spacing them 14 inches apart, the same width as her sod bricks. The 12 saplings created a curved skeleton that looked, frankly, like the ribs of some enormous animal. Mary Catherine O'Brien rode past, saw the structure, and actually stopped to stare. "What in heaven's name is that supposed to be?" she asked. "A roof," Ingrid said. "That's not a roof, that's... I don't even know what that is. Where are the shingles? Where's the pitch? Can't afford shingles. Then use sod, like your house. At least that's a proven method." Ingrid had considered that a traditional sod roof would need supporting poles running perpendicular to the willow ribs, then a layer of brush, then the sod bricks laid grass-side down. It would work, probably, but it would also weigh close to 400 pounds when wet, and she wasn't certain her willow frame would support that load. So she'd planned something different, something she'd seen Icelandic fishermen use for storing dried cod back in Norway. A double-curved design where the sod bricks would be laid directly onto the willow ribs, following the curve, creating a barrel vault that would be self-supporting. The mathematics of a barrel vault were older than written language. Romans had used them for aqueducts. Persians had used them for ice houses in the desert. The curve distributed weight outward and downward, turning the roof itself into a continuous arch. As long as she maintained the curve and kept the weight balanced, the structure shouldn't collapse. In theory, she started laying sod on the willow ribs at dawn on October 11th. Each brick had to be trimmed to fit the curve, shaped with Lars's draw knife until it sat flush against the one beside it. The bricks on the bottom of the curve at the eaves were trapezoidal, wider at the bottom than the top. The ones near the peak were almost rectangular. She worked from both sides simultaneously, keeping the weight balanced, checking the curve every fourth brick. The willow creaked but didn't break. By nightfall she'd covered half the roof. Sophie's fever broke on October 12th. Elizabeth Kowalski brought her back to Ingrid's claim wrapped in a wool blanket, pale but alive, asking for bread and butter. Ingrid fed her, put her to bed, and went back outside to finish the roof. She laid the final brick at sunset, a narrow wedge that locked the whole structure together at the peak. Then she plastered every seam with mud, a mixture of clear-rich soil from the riverbank, mixed with water and dried grass for binding. The mud would dry in a day or two, hardening into something close to adobe, sealing the gaps between bricks. The structure had taken 4 days to build, and it cost her exactly $9.37, $3 for nails, $4 for a roll of heavy tar paper she'd bought in Yankton to line the inside of the roof insurance against leaks, and $2.37 for a simple wooden door with leather hinges. Everything else, the sod, the willow, the mud, even the rawhide lashing had been harvested from her claim or the riverbank. Thomas Brennan came by on October 14th with a gift, a thermometer he'd mail-ordered from Chicago, the kind that measured both temperature and humidity. "Brought you this," he said gruffly. "Figure if you're going to run an experiment, might as well measure it proper. I still think it won't work, but I respect what you're trying to do." He helped her hang the thermometer inside the new woodshed, where it could measure the air temperature and moisture levels. Then he looked around the interior, 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, 7 feet high at the peak, and shook his head. "If this actually keeps your wood dry, I'll eat my hat." Jacob Weiss was more cautious. "The construction is better than I expected," he admitted. "The barrel vault, that's smart. Weight's distributed well. But sod absorbs water, Ingrid. When it rains, those walls are going to soak it up like a sponge, and then it's going to drip inside. I've seen it happen." What Jacob didn't know, what Ingrid had observed during her 4 months living in a sod house, was that properly stacked sod didn't behave like most people expected. The grass roots created a mat that actually repelled water at the surface, while the soil beneath allowed moisture to permeate slowly but evenly through the entire thickness of the wall. In a wall 3 feet thick, rain might penetrate 4 inches before the capillary action stopped it. The water then evaporated from the exterior surface over the next few days. The interior stayed dry because the moisture never made it all the way through. Her woodshed walls were only 28 inches thick. She'd built them in a double layer for strength, but the same principle should apply. And the barrel vault roof, with its continuous curve, shouldn't collect standing water at all. Rain would hit the curved surface and run down the sides, just like water running off a round stone. At least, that was the theory. The first real test came on October 17th, when a 3-day rainstorm moved through the James River Valley, dropping 4¼ inches of cold rain mixed with sleet. The temperature hovered right around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just warm enough to prevent snow, just cold enough to make everything miserable. Thomas Brennan's traditional lumber woodshed, with its proper roof pitch and tight carpentry, kept his wood perfectly dry. Mary Catherine O'Brien's elevated platform and replacement top leaked in 6 places, soaking 1/3 of her wood supply, and Ingrid's peculiar curved structure. On the morning of October 20th, when the rain finally stopped, Ingrid opened the wooden door and stepped inside. The air smelled like earth and dried grass. The thermometer read 41 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity at 63%. She'd stacked her remaining 3.5 cords of split cottonwood inside 5 days earlier, piling it loosely to allow air circulation. She pulled a piece from the middle of the stack and examined it, bone dry. She checked the bottom layer, where moisture would accumulate if it was going to accumulate anywhere. Also dry. She ran her hand along the interior wall where sod met ground. Slightly damp, but not wet, and the moisture was clearly moving downward, wicking into the earth rather than spreading inward. The exterior walls were another story. They'd absorbed water during the storm, darkening from tan to deep brown, and they looked heavy, almost saturated, but the water hadn't penetrated to the inside. The 28-inch thickness, combined with the natural drainage properties of the sod and the waterproof tar paper lining the interior of the roof, had created exactly what Ingrid had hoped for, a buffer zone that absorbed moisture on the outside while keeping the inside dry. Jacob Weiss came by that afternoon to check on her. She showed him inside, let him examine the wood, handed him a piece to split for her stove. He struck it with her axe, and it split clean with a sharp crack, the sound of dry wood, not the dull thud of damp. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "It actually works." "He told you to think about the Lakota larges," Ingrid said. "This isn't anything like a large. No, but it's the same principle. Curve sheds water. Thick walls buffer temperature. Nature's been doing this for a long time." Thomas Brennan was harder to convince. He came by 3 times over the next 2 weeks, checking the thermometer readings, canturing, examining the wood, looking for signs of failure. The temperature inside the woodshed stayed remarkably stable, between 38 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of outside conditions, while the humidity fluctuated between 58 and 67%. Compare that to Brennan's lumber woodshed, where temperatures swung from 28 to 54 degrees and humidity ranged from 43 to 79%, and the advantage became clear. The sod's thermal mass was acting like a battery, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it at night, smoothing out the extremes. "It's stable, I'll give you that," Brennan said on November 3rd. "But let's see how it handles a real winter. Wait until January when we get 2 weeks straight of below zero temperatures. That's when lumber construction shows its value. Your sod's going to freeze solid, and when it thaws in spring, the whole thing will collapse." He wasn't being difficult. He'd seen structures fail, had watched his neighbor's poorly built dugout collapse in a spring thaw, killing 2 pigs and nearly killing the neighbor's son. He was trying to warn her, trying to prevent tragedy. Ingrid understood that, respected it, and kept stacking her wood. The winter of 1873 to 1874 was, by all accounts, fairly typical for Dakota Territory. The first major blizzard hit on November 19th, dropping 14 inches of snow and driving temperatures down to -18 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 more blizzards followed in December. January brought the coldest temperatures, -31 degrees on January 11th, -27 on January 15th. A solid week from January 22nd through 28th, where the mercury never climbed above zero. Ingrid burned 3/4 of a cord of wood each month, which was actually less than she'd anticipated. The wood stayed dry, split cleanly, and produced heat efficiently. But the real surprise came in March during the thaw. Thomas Brennan had been right to worry about freeze-thaw cycles. Lumber construction handled them well because wood didn't absorb much moisture. But sod was dirt, and dirt absorbed water, froze solid, expanded, contracted, and generally behaved in unpredictable ways. When the temperature climbed above freezing on March 4th, for the first time in 14 weeks, Brennan rode over to Ingrid's place, expecting to find a collapsed pile of mud and dead grass. What he found instead was a structure that looked almost identical to how it had looked in October, except the sod had compressed slightly under its own weight. The walls had settled from 28 inches thick to 26 inches, and the grass on the exterior surface had started growing, not just surviving, actively growing. The roots that held the sod together had never died during the freeze because they'd been insulated by the massive soil around them. When spring arrived, they woke up, sent out new shoots, and turned the entire woodshed into a living structure covered in fresh grass. "Well, I'll be damned," Brennan said, for the second time that season. "It's alive." "Sod does that," Ingrid said. She was in her garden, turning soil for spring planting. Safi was healthy again, running circles around the yard, chasing a prairie chicken that had wandered too close. As long as the roots don't die, it keeps growing. Means I don't have to replaster the outside. Grass holds it together better than mud ever could. Jacob Weiss showed up an hour later with his measuring tape and notebook. He'd been documenting Ingrid's woodshed all winter, sketching the design, recording temperature and humidity readings, noting changes. "I want to build 3 of these for other families," he said. "The Johnsons need wood storage. So do the Petersons and the Rileys. I'll charge them for labor, but I want to make sure I build them right. Can you show me exactly how you cut the sod, the angle of the walls, how you bent the willow?" Over the next 2 years, Jacob Weiss built 17 sod-roofed woodsheds in the Yankton region, each one based on Ingrid's design. Thomas Brennan built to himself, grudgingly admitting they worked better than he'd expected. Mary Catherine O'Brien abandoned her elevated platform entirely and hired Jacob to build her a proper curved structure in the spring of 1875. The design spread, adapted, evolved. Some folks added ventilation holes near the peak to increase airflow. Others experimented with different roof materials: cottonwood, bark, doubled tar paper, even thin sheets of tin salvaged from old stoves. The economics were hard to argue with. Ingrid's $9 woodshed kept wood as dry as Brennan's $17 lumber structure, sometimes drier because of the stable humidity. It required no maintenance except for occasional patching if prairie dogs dug near the foundation, and it actually improved with age as the grass roots grew thicker and bound the sod more tightly together. By 1876, Ingrid's woodshed had become a local landmark. The little curved structure that proved expensive lumber wasn't the only answer to frontier problems. But here's what interested me most when I researched this story, and why I think it matters beyond just one woman's clever solution to a fuel storage problem. Ingrid's design was a perfect example of what archaeologists call vernacular architecture, building methods developed by regular people using local materials and observational knowledge rather than formal training. You can see the same principles in Navajo hogans in the Southwest, which used similar earth-sheltered curved roof designs to maintain stable interior temperatures. You can see it in the qanats of ancient Persia, underground water channels that used barrel vaults to prevent collapse. You can see it in the root cellars of Scandinavia, buried structures that kept vegetables from freezing in winter and spoiling in summer. What all these structures had in common was an understanding that the earth itself could be a building material, a thermal regulator, and a water management system all at once. Modern construction tends to fight against the earth. We dig basements and line them with concrete to keep water out. We insulate above-ground structures to prevent heat transfer. We build roofs with aggressive pitch to shed water quickly. But frontier settlers like Ingrid understood something we've largely forgotten. If you work with the earth's natural properties instead of fighting against them, you can create structures that are cheaper, more stable, and often more effective than conventional designs. The sod woodshed performed better than lumber construction in one specific but important way: moisture stability. Lumber sheds experienced wild humidity swings because wood is a poor thermal mass. It heats up quickly, cools down quickly, and provides almost no buffering against temperature changes. This caused condensation cycles inside the shed. Warm afternoon air would enter, cool down at night, and deposit moisture on the wood. Ingrid's shed, with its 26 inches of earth acting as thermal mass, prevented those swings. The temperature stayed stable, the humidity stayed stable, and condensation never had a chance to form. Was it perfect? No. The structure required more labor to build than a simple lumber shed. Cutting and hauling sod was back-breaking work. It was also permanent. You couldn't disassemble it and move it if you changed claims, and it required specific soil conditions. Loose, sandy soil wouldn't hold together well enough for sod construction. But in prairie regions where good sod was abundant and lumber was expensive or unavailable, the design made perfect economic and practical sense. Here's the thing about frontier solutions that I want you to think about. When resources are limited and stakes are high, people figure things out. They observe, they experiment, they adapt techniques from other cultures, they combine old knowledge in new ways. Ingrid wasn't an engineer. She hadn't studied architecture. She was a widow with a sick daughter, trying to survive winter with almost no money. But she'd been paying attention to how her sod house worked, to how water behaved on curved surfaces, to how the Lakota kept things dry, to how thermal mass affected temperature stability. That kind of observational problem solving is a skill we've largely lost in the modern world. We've got specialists for everything now, experts who can design optimal solutions using computer models and materials science. And that's valuable, no question. But there's something to be said for the kind of knowledge that comes from direct observation, from living inside a problem until you understand it well enough to solve it with whatever materials you have at hand. If this story meant something to you, if you valued documenting these kinds of forgotten techniques before they disappear entirely, I want to ask you to subscribe. Not because I need the numbers, but because this knowledge deserves to be preserved. Every technique we lose, every clever adaptation that gets forgotten, that's a piece of human problem solving that took generations to develop and can vanish in a single lifetime. Help us keep this frontier knowledge alive so future generations can learn from it. Ingrid Halvorsen lived on that claim until 1891, when she sold it to a younger family and moved to Yankton to live with Safi, who'd married a banker's son and had 3 children of her own. Her sod woodshed was still standing when she sold the property, 18 years after she'd built it, still keeping firewood dry through Dakota winters. The new owners used it until 1903, when they finally built a larger lumber structure and tore down the old curved shed to make room for a chicken coop. There's no physical trace of Ingrid's woodshed anymore. The last photograph of it was taken in 1897 by a traveling photographer documenting rural architecture, and that photograph was lost in a fire in 1924. But the knowledge survived because 17 families built similar structures based on her design, and some of them passed the technique down to their children, who passed it to their children, who mentioned it in oral histories recorded in the 1970s by historians trying to document frontier life. That's how knowledge survives when nobody's writing textbooks about it. It survives in stories, in demonstrated results, in the quiet observation that something worked when it shouldn't have. Thomas Brennan eventually admitted he'd been wrong about sod sheds. Jacob Weiss incorporated the curved roof technique into his professional repertoire. Mary Catherine O'Brien wrote about it in a letter to her sister in Boston, describing it as a barbaric but surprisingly effective method. The broader lesson here isn't really about woodsheds, or sod construction, or even frontier architecture. It's about the relationship between necessity, observation, and innovation. When Ingrid looked at her problem, not enough money for lumber, too much wood getting ruined by weather, she didn't accept the conventional wisdom that only expensive solutions could work. She looked at what had worked in other contexts, adapted the principles to her specific situation, and tested her theory with materials she could afford. That's not genius. That's just careful thinking combined with willingness to try something different. But it's the kind of thinking that built the American frontier, structure by structure, solution by solution, family by family. It's the kind of thinking that's worth preserving, worth studying, worth passing down to people who might face their own impossible problems with limited resources. Ingrid spent $9.37 to solve a problem that conventional wisdom said required $17 minimum. She kept her family alive through a Dakota winter, proved the skeptics wrong, and created a design that other families copied and adapted. And she did it all with dirt, grass, river willow, and observation, as frontier wisdom. That's the knowledge we're trying to preserve here. And that's why, if this story resonated with you, I'm asking you to be part of keeping it alive. Subscribe, share it with people who value this kind of practical history, and help make sure these techniques don't disappear completely.